Now it's back to Chris Kinney with Viewpoint.
Thanks, Vanessa. Now, viewers, I want you to throw your minds back 5 years ago. 5 years ago this week, in fact, back in November 2007, when the Labor government first came to power. One of their absolute strengths at that time was the union movement. The union campaign against work choices. It cost them about $30 million, and it was absolutely essential for Labor in terms of returning to government after almost 12 years out of power. And make no mistake, the Howard government was really seen to be too tough on the unions and by extension, of course, too tough on workers. Well, fast forward 5 years, of course, and the unions have really never been more powerful. We've seen time and time again how influential they are with the Labor government. They did get rid of work choices, of course. It was repealed, and they've got the Fair Work Act in place now, which puts the unions back in a very central position in economic management and in the way business runs in this country now. We even saw the unions play a dominant role in getting rid of a Prime Minister. Yes, a lot of union leaders helped in rolling Kevin Rudd and replacing him with Julia Gillard. But the union movement does have some serious problems. Its membership is declining, certainly as a percentage of the whole workforce. 2 decades ago, more than half of us were union members. Now, less than 1 in 5 of us is a member of a union. And of course, we've seen some fairly horrible union corruption scandals that are still unfolding around the country this year. They are creating enormous trouble. I think initially, of course, we're talking about the Health Services Union and investigations and civil charges pending there. And of course, we have the AWU affair. So what of the union movement? What about its power? Will it be a help or a hindrance as we go into an election year for the Labor government? After the break, I'll be back with a very much an inside panel that can answer some of these questions about the future of the Labor movement as we go into that election year. Back in a moment. Welcome back to Viewpoint. Let's shed some light on what's happening in the union movement. For this panel, I'm joined from Melbourne by Grace Collier, who's an industrial relations consultant, has worked in the union movement and now often works against the union movement. And you've been involved in all of this for 20 years, Grace. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And in the studio with me here is Mark Lennon, who heads up Unions New South Wales. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Good evening, Chris.
Now, is the union movement now in a more powerful position than it's ever been? Of course, you have a Labor government in place. That's useful for the union movement. But with the Fair Work Act, have you been placed right back at the centre of economic management in this country?
I think what's important to remember is working people in this country. They're the ones that need to be front and centre when it comes to industrial relations. And that's what the Fair Work legislation was all about. It was about allowing them to have their say about what sort of industrial relations system they think the country should have and how they should be represented.
So on behalf of working people, you are in a more powerful position than you ever have been before?
No, working people have got more say in how they want to be represented, and that's what's important. And that was what was at the basis of the whole debate going back to the 2007 election.
Grace Collier, how would you describe it? We've seen a lot of reform in this area over the years, started, of course, by Labor governments under the Hawke and Keating governments. Have we seen the pendulum go back too far, giving too much power to the union movement?
Chris, I think the issue is a little bit complicated. The Fair Work Act is one part of it, and as Mark said, that really is putting working people front and centre because the Act is about the rights of people. It's not really so much about the rights of unions. But what has happened is the unions have been able to engage in overreach for a whole lot of reasons, and employers and the employer associations have been unable to set boundaries and keep those boundaries firm. So yes, things are, you know, in a lot of ways a little bit out of control, but it's not just as simple as the Fair Work Act. It's about who's in power and the overreach by unions.
You're actually very critical of the way private enterprise deals with this. You think that they cede too much in the workplace to unions rather than exercising their rights under the Fair Work Act.
Yes, I mean, look, under the Fair Work Act there are an awful lot of opportunities for employers to have direct relationships with their staff. Of course, people want to be members of unions and that's their right. And, you know, employers can't try and force people not to be members of unions, but certainly the Fair Work Act does provide for employers having direct relationships with their staff. The problem that we see in this country is the relationship between unions and the employer organisations, which are, after all, just unions. They're just employer unions. And those relationships are interdependent. And those two groups tend to get together and do deals that aren't necessarily in the employer's interest, aren't necessarily in workers' interests, but those deals are imposed on the business and on the economy.
Does that ring true to you, Mark, that employer groups do deals with unions? These are in training programs and the like, where money gets paid to union training companies and the like?
Well, I didn't expect to be here defending employer organisations, rest assured. No. But let me say that, no, I think in any economy, a modern economy like Australia, we have various industry organisations representing their particular members, particular employer organisations. We have discussions and negotiations with them, but I don't believe that that is having any adverse impact on our economy. And certainly I don't think you'll get that argument from the employer organisations, and certainly not from AIG.
What I'm going to look at now is membership numbers, and I just put up some numbers on the screen for you now, and we can see that overall union membership across the workforce now is at 18%. That's less than 1 in 5 workers in the country is a member of the union. Now, when you break that down a bit, you can see that in the public sector, the number is much higher. The public service has a 43% level of union membership, but that of course means in the private sector only 13%. You know, just over 10%, just over 1 in 10 workers actually a member of a union. Is this a real threat to the union movement, Mark?
Well, as you mentioned, I think in your intro, Chris, that union membership has been on the decline since, in fact, the 1960s, and that's a reflection of the changing nature of the workforce and the structure of our economy. It's gone from an industrial economy to a service sector economy, and we've seen the types of employment, part-time, temporary and casual, increase, and that hasn't helped union membership. It's not unique to Australia, it's across the developed world, but there is no doubt amongst the community at large that they believe that we have a role, and we have an important role to play in the economy, even if people aren't joining. And it's not just trade unions. We've got a crisis of collectivism generally in this country, and if you look at any collective entity, be it a service club or be it churches, they're all suffering from declining membership. Doesn't mean that the community doesn't believe we have a role to play.
Yeah, Grace Collier, how is it that unions are still so powerful and in fact wealthy when their memberships are so low?
Well, Chris, you know, the union movement started the Labor Party, not the other way around. The union movement funds the Labor Party, and the union movement chose the Prime Minister that we have. So I think that question is you know, the answer to that is in all of that information.
Well, I'll just go through that because, and then I'll come back to the finances. I just have another graphic here just to make it clear for people. Of course, the way that the Labor Party is run, and you're right, the Labor Party was established as the political arm of the union movement. Now, in their conventions and all their major decisions, the unions have 50% of the vote. It used to be more, but now it's 50%. And of course, with factions and whatever, they can exert an enormous amount of control over that. And the branches, the ALP branches, have the other 50%. The unions, being very much more organised for their 50%, hold a lot of sway. And what a lot of people don't realise, of course, is that all ALP MPs must be members of a union. So, you know, of course, that sort of explains the political influence of the unions, and the ALP, of course, is their party, and that's both a strength and a weakness for the ALP. But what about finances? You've had some interesting things to say, Grace Collier, about how unions still make a lot of money, even though their memberships are not what they'd like them to be.
Yes, Chris. Look, and you know, there's nothing wrong with divesting your business, but some time ago unions sniffed the wind and they began to put in place alternative income streams. They made investments on you know, matters like property, businesses, things like that, and you know, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a free country, but they did that because they saw the need to have alternative income streams because membership was shrinking. And what really matters is being able to pay the bills, I guess, and you know, engage in that sort of industrial activity.
Can I just take exception there? I think let's just get serious about union sources of revenue. Primarily, it still remains membership fees, and I would question anyone to suggest that unions are getting significant fees from investments or other areas. Yes, we have property investments because it's very wise for the membership to actually own your own building and things of that nature. That's a normal commercial transaction. And yes, there are unions getting money from different investments, such as property, as I point out. But in the main, we still rely on our membership fee as the main source of revenue.
What about your involvement in the superannuation funds and taking management fees or board fees from that? They get paid into a lot of the unions.
We certainly do not take management fees from. That's the preserve of the fund management industry. And they're next door in the business section.
Yeah, sorry, the board members get paid fees, and some keep it themselves. Others would pay it back into the union.
Each union has a policy on it, and some, as you say, keep it, and some pay it back into the union. But for those that do pay it back to the union, it's still a very small percentage of the union's revenue. If you've got some unions here with the size of their membership, they have quite significant turnover, and a $50,000 board fee is quite insubstantial in that regard.
And what about relationships with training companies and the like?
There are some who have got joint training companies with employers in the industry because they think that's to the benefit of the industry. And it's primarily there to ensure that their membership can get access to training and decent training, and not for commercial reasons.
Are there any dangers in these sorts of divestments? I mean, we'll come to some of the corruption scandals that the union movement's dealing with at the moment, but do some of these commercial operations create any dangers in that area?
I don't think so, because they're not significant. They're not the major source of revenue, as I say, for these unions.
And what about the taxation implications?
That's always something.
Because you do not pay tax on the income you earn from members' fees.
That's right.
Do you pay tax on the other
Depends
income?
on the structure of the particular income and whether it's of a corporate nature.
Yeah, well, Grace Collier, do you think if the unions as a whole were brought into the tax system, that would encourage greater transparency and accountability?
Chris, I think if unions and employer organisations were bound by the same rules that business were, we would solve a lot of our industrial relations problems in this country. Employer associations wouldn't want that, of course, and I guess unions wouldn't want that either, and I must admit if I was in that position I wouldn't want that either. But the problem that we have is that, if you like, our economy has two lanes. In one lane you have unions and employer organisations who don't pay tax and who are bound by very, very different rules, doing deals and imposing their deals on the employers, which are in the other lane, and they're subject to very different rules. So you have one stream imposing agreements and so on another stream, and it just doesn't work, and that's why we have a lot of the problems we have.
I can't see where we're doing deals with employer associations and imposing them on employers. I mean, we are in a system of enterprise bargaining. Enterprise industrial arrangements are done at the enterprise level. I mean, this is we've moved from a centralised wage fixing system and industrial agreements across industries down to a system where it's at the enterprise. That's the nub of our Fair Work legislation.
Grace, you see more collusion in that marketplace?
Oh, look, I mean, with the greatest respect, Mark, you're entitled to your opinion, but I'm sorry, I have to say that a lot of employer organisations are, at best, not equipped to deal with unions, and at worst they collude. I've written about examples of those. They're there, and I just, you're entitled to your opinion, Mark, but I just agree to disagree with you on that one.
Well,
that's no evidence.
Let's look at what really counts, and that is creating jobs for Australians, and whether the current arrangements are actually stifling the economy's efforts to create jobs. And just for before we get a comment from each of you, I want to refresh your memory of what one of the employer groups, the Australian Industry Group, said last week. Its chief, Innes Willocks, had quite a go at the current industrial relations arrangements. Here he is.
When it comes to union claims, the term job security is shorthand for restricting the use of labour hire and contractors, restricting outsourcing, restricting casual employment, negotiating excessive redundancy packages so that companies cannot afford to lay off staff, and locking unions into company decision-making processes when workplace changes are being contemplated. Of course, these union claims inhibit the ability of businesses to be responsive and adaptable to market changes.
Well, Mark Lennon, there is a lot of commentary coming around at the moment suggesting that the union movement is a handbrake on productivity and on investment in this country.
Well, can I just say, if we're in collusion with the AIG after that comment, I'd hate to see when we're in disagreement. There's no evidence that I can see that says that we're a handbrake on productivity in this nation at the present time. This debate about industrial relations and the Fair Work legislation being the problem with the nation's productivity doesn't stand up to any significant test. The evidence isn't there.